I mean, it's astonishing when you think that right here and now, right here the three of us are sitting around in my office here. I can't help but think behind your eyes, a little space in there, behind my eyes, a little space. Every time you introspect, a little space in there, and my ideas go around. And we know that that's not true.
Julian Jaynes was trained as a behavioral psychologist, but he became interested in the nature of consciousness and the evolution of inner space. He studied the development of consciousness in the history and literature of early civilizations, and he discovered what seemed to be a definite change, a difference, around 1000 BC. He says that before that time, people didn't think of themselves in introspective terms or consciously make decisions about what to do, but rather they heard auditory hallucinations conceived of as the voices of gods. Around this time there was great chaos and confusion in the civilized world, and these voices no longer sufficed to help man deal with his life. Slowly he began to develop an inner consciousness, an awareness of a self inside himself that seemed to exist in his mind. This was probably the origin of the phrase, "you're out of your mind."
Actually, the space that you and I introspect on isn't inside you. It is nowhere. Just as nobody wants to say that 2 and 2 equals 4 is located in any particular place. You know, it just isn't.
Bicameral man, the bicameral mind. This is the name Julian Jaynes has given to this preconscious man. This man who did not know himself, but who knew gods.
I guess I found about 6 years ago a whole bunch of tributaries and rivulets were all starting to come together and to go along one particular track. And out of that came this very different theory of the origin, evolutionary origin of consciousness. And one has to see this against the background of the whole history, really, of this part of psychology that goes back to when the theory of evolution came into the middle of the 19th century. Because everybody, including Darwin, everybody thought, okay, so human species are evolved on the natural selection and so on, and the mind just goes along with that and has evolved too. And therefore you found a whole group of people following Darwin who were trying to study the evolution of learning in animal species, and this is the evolution of mind and consciousness, and nobody was really, being very accurate about what they meant by consciousness. Well, what happened to me was that I spent the first part of my scientific career following along in that same era until I began to see that this isn't going to solve the problem of where did consciousness come from, and you had to start off from different criteria about what consciousness was. Well, I came to a new theory of consciousness, that consciousness is very, very much based on language, on the nature of linguistic metaphor, on the ability to tell stories, on the ability to have analogs of yourself and to create a kind of metaphoric space, which is this space we assume somewhere behind our eyes in ourselves and behind the eyes of someone we're looking to. And in that space we do various operations that help us decide what we're going to do. And if that is so, then it means that this problem of the origin of consciousness that Darwin felt went all the way back to protozoa, that other people feel go back to the origin of mammals, or when the cortex evolves, or some other kind of neurological mechanism involved, that this is all wrong, that consciousness developed in human culture after the evolution of language. And then I started off like a detective story to try to find out where that would be, because that means it would really be sometime between 10,000 BC and the present. And so I started off in this detective story.
How did you define consciousness?
What? How did I define consciousness?
Yeah.
Consciousness Well, now here let me be a little bit academic and say there are two kinds of definition as logicians like to speak about it. There's the denotative, which means you point to something, and then there's the connotative or constitutional, or what is it made of kind of definition. And I'm prefacing what I'm about to say that way because what I'm going to say I think will be a little bit unsatisfactory to you when you hear it at first. Denotatively, I simply define consciousness as what you do when you introspect. I simply ask you to think of something in your past or something in your future or anything like that, and everybody knows what those words mean, and that's a good denotative definition. You point to it by asking somebody to introspect. Nobody has any difficulty with it. All right. That's the denotative definition. The constitutive definition is what I really was just saying, that we have these metaphors that we, in culture and in our childhood, build up into a kind of metaphor kind of space that we assume. And I like to compare it more to mathematics, you see, than to a box in which you stick memories and so on like this. We get this when we introspect on a memory, something future we're going to do, anything at all. We get this feeling, and it's a funny feeling of space. It's not like the space out there, and yet it is spatial. And we have a little analog of ourselves in that space. You can imagine yourself being miles away now, or you can imagine yourself in the future or in the past, and so on. And you have analogs of everything else, these things called ideas and everything, whatever they are. Now, this whole thing, I think, which we call consciousness, can be looked at and can be examined, and we can get certain things out of it, such as an analog self, and try to experiment and study on that, or the quality of spatialization. We're just in the beginning trying to look at these things in this way, because it is a very new way of looking at consciousness. It's saying something. One of the most important things it's saying is that consciousness isn't nearly as extensive as the 19th century thought it was, or as most people walking the street think. If you ask the man in the street, what is consciousness? Oh, he'd say, consciousness is my mind, wow, it's everything, and so on. But it isn't. It's a very, very small part of mentality, and it comes in to help guide you around into what you're doing, but it's astonishing the number of things that everybody does in which consciousness...
That are
mechanical, which consciousness doesn't come in at all. We're learning things constantly, right here now, as we're talking here in my office. We are learning things about each other. We are training each other into this conversation. We're not going to aware of this at all. In fact, I hope we're being aware of what I'm talking about. At least I'm trying to be aware of that as we go on, but I'm not conscious of gestures that I'm using here in front of the microphone. So. Yeah.
If you were, you probably wouldn't be able to do it.
That's right. Immediately, something else happens.
So this consciousness is guiding the automated kind of reflexes that are a big.
I think that's too simple a way to look at it, because I think you see that it isn't just automated reflexes. What's left over. There's a lot of learning. It's not just a reflexive matter, one's ordinary behavior. It's adapting itself all the time to all different cues, to everything that's going on around you constantly, and changing itself. And it's really not automatic, although it feels automatic when we're not conscious of it and we're not aware of it. What consciousness does is to come in on top of all this when you need it. And it can tell you if you're try to decide where you're going to go to lunch today. All right, there's various alternatives and possibilities, and you become conscious of that. At the time you're being conscious of that, you're not being conscious of other things, and you don't have to be.
What do you call the other big thing that is everything that isn't consciousness?
Well, I refer to that simply as mentality if you want to, but I'm trying not to make a big important thing about what kind of names we give to it. It is the organization of behavior. And of course, the theory that I've been involved in is indeed going back and discovering that mankind, in all his early centuries of civilization, was going on the basis without consciousness at all, and building the great civilizations that are behind us all and everything we're doing.
As you said, about 10,000 BC or so.
No,
I was going to ask you what happened.
All right, to go back to the detective story about trying to find out when consciousness evolved. 10,000 BC is when man left tribal life. He was living before that, Neanderthal man, living in tribes of, let's say, about 30, something like this. Very similar to modern primates, only much more developed, using tools. Language had evolved probably between 100,000 BC and 10,000 BC. And at 10,000 BC, suddenly man becomes agricultural. Now, the various theories and debates going on at the present time among scientists about the actual causation. Some people think it was because the glacier had retreated northward, bringing very different kinds of climates into the Near East. That's part of it, certainly. And there are probably, though, other reasons. But for whatever, what happened was that mankind suddenly is no longer tribal. He is now living in cities of 200 first, but then immediately they explode into thousands. And this is the beginning of what we can call civilization. I'm using civilization not in a term of praise of being good or anything, but simply in the terms of man being able to live in cities, that's all. And it is an accomplishment. And this began just about 10,000, 9,000 BC. Well, I would feel that the origin of consciousness had to begin somewhere. If you try to establish the extreme dates, it would be from about that time up to somewhere closer to the present. And when I examined this, I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if we went back to the first writings of mankind and found that they had a different kind of mind? Well, I didn't think this would turn out, and I had the great good fortune of being ignorant.
And tenured.
So, the first writings of mankind begin about 3000 BC, and they are in cuneiform, hieroglyphics, hieratic, and each of these is a very difficult language to translate even now. It's just dying for computers to be put upon this task, because each of these are a group of symbols, 500 perhaps, in which each one of them, for instance in cuneiform, I'm thinking of one that is 7 different syllables and about 6 different words, and it's exactly the same thing, and the only way you can decide what that symbol means is by its context. And when it comes to anything abstract, it's extremely difficult to translate. So it's really to go back to a language that we have a continuity with, and this is Greek. And if you go back and look at the Iliad, it is a very, very interesting task from the point of view of what is this mentality. Because in the Iliad, people are not conscious the way you and I are. They don't sit down and think and plan out what to do. Instead, they hear voices called gods. They see visions and then hear voices that tell them what to do. And these voices, called gods, are indeed the agents that plan the Trojan War, that decide everything that is going to go on. And it's very hard for we who are conscious to go back and try to imagine that Achilles doesn't have any of this inner space that we do. He has nothing behind his eyes. He doesn't imagine space behind other people's eyes. And we absolutely cannot identify with him and try to feel what it is like to be him as we do with everybody else. It's a very, very different kind of thing. Achilles is not conscious. He has a different mentality in which it's like he has 2 sides of his mentality. One which is himself speaking, and the other are these auditory voices, hallucinations that he hears. And this is what I'm calling the bicameral mind. And the word bicameral simply is a metaphor, of course, from 2 houses of a legislature. an upper and a lower house. That's all really it does mean. But it means that there was this kind of mentality, not conscious, in which in every novel situation, the very novelty of the situation built up a little bit of biochemical stress that then triggered off in the brain auditory hallucinations.
So it was happening inside the mind.
Yes, inside the brain.
Inside the brain.
You know, we have to be very careful of the language here.
Okay, and there was a biochemical basis for it.
Yes. Just as there is nowadays. Any of us, if we were backed into the wall, into the corner, losing everything we have in our lives that's valuable to us, and people crossing us one way or another, we, I think, would build up biochemical stress and begin hearing auditory hallucinations. And this is, of course, what happens in schizophrenia, except the schizophrenic patient is one who genetically has a lower threshold for such things. Now, one immediately has to add here that perhaps we can talk about schizophrenia a little bit later, because there are lots of qualifications about here. Only 50% of schizophrenic patients hear auditory hallucinations. So perhaps I better save that. But I'm saying that the quality of the auditory hallucination was just as it is in a modern schizophrenic patient, as it is in many of us who may at one time have heard auditory hallucinations, just as clear as it was to Joan of Arc or to many other people through history, perfectly normal people who hear hallucinations directing them, telling them what to do.
When the going gets rough, the voices come in?
That's right. It doesn't have to be very rough, though, at all. You see, I think this bicameral mind is the kind of mentality man had going way back to the beginning of agriculture, 9,000, 10,000 BC. There it was a simple matter that I think language was evolved with hallucinations being very, very much a part of it. And then when mankind moved to a civilization, it was because he could hear hallucinations from his king or whatever, tribal chieftain. This growing into hallucinations from gods. When the chief died, you still could hear hallucinations from him and so on. It's rather complicated, but it all works out, you see, into a progression that makes it very reasonable how this all came about. And that from 9,000 BC up to 1500 BC, this was man's mind. And that all the early civilizations, wherever you go, civilization starts in Mesopotamia, spreads to Egypt, spreads to the Hittites, then we can go over to the Indus Valley, we can go over to the Yangtze and the Chinese things. Yes, and go over to the early Mexican civilizations 1,000 years later, or the civilizations of the Peruvian Andes that end in the Incas. All of them have this similarity of gods. Have you ever thought? Gods, that's an odd idea. And where can this come from? We are so used now to thinking in terms of atheism and so on, and from our own particular religious heritages, which doesn't really apply to the question as I'm trying to phrase it. When you go back in history, it isn't God, it is always the plurality, thousands of gods everywhere. What can all that mean? I'm saying it's very simple. These were auditory hallucinations which everybody had to one extent or another. And these auditory hallucinations were organized in the brain, that the brain was coding things for certain reasons back into language that the person only can hear. And this guided him, told him what to do whenever a novel situation came up. Now the evidence, if we look at these early civilizations, wherever we go, there are always things like idols, figurines, statues of various kinds that I think were hallucinogenic or allowed more easily a person to hear an auditory hallucination.
It's like what Humphrey always says about the difference between a saint and a madman is the quality of his voices. If you've got good voices, you make it.
Okay.
Well, was that the case then? Was the difference between a saint and a madman that then?
Well, if one takes the theory that I'm working on and applies it to schizophrenia, let me just sort of begin by saying this. Schizophrenia, a part of schizophrenia, is a partial relapse to the bicameral mind. Now, one can say that everybody before 1500 BC was schizophrenic. There was no such thing as madness before 1000 BC. If one goes back and looks for it, one can't find it. One can find such things as idiocy, but there's nobody set off from the community the way we do with mental patients until one gets into the later period, the period that I regard as consciousness. Another very interesting thing is to look at Plato here. Plato, when he was a young man in the Phaedo, has one of the most beautiful passages in all his works about the various kinds of madness. And he has 4 kinds, all based on visitations of the gods, more or less, but you don't know whether Plato really believes it in a mythical kind of way or in an actual way. But whatever, madness is a blessing. It's regarded as good. And he says that between the word manike and mantike, which are 2 Greek words of the time, only one, just the addition of the T to the end, and one means madness, the other one means prophecy. And he says they're exactly the same thing. Now, when Plato is an older man and comes to write the Laws, his last work, he has a conception of madness that's just like ours. It is very different, and it is indeed that the family should take care of mentally ill people who are manichae, that these people can't take care of themselves, and that they have completely wrong ideas, that they can fly, or that they are gods, or something else. Now, between in Plato's own lifetime, you see, this is the whole conception of mental disease is starting to develop, and it's something that really we should get some scholars to go into with much more depth. My reading is from Plato, and that's most of the evidence that I know. But then you find right after that's 400 BC, and then right up through the first centuries BC and the first centuries AD, you find the development of schizophrenia the way we come to think of it. In fact, one of the interesting things is that they had another word for schizophrenia called paranoia, not our paranoia at all. Paranoia coming from 2 words, noia meaning mind and para meaning beside, and it really meant to have another mind beside your own directing you. And the word paranoia meaning madness goes on up until about the 2nd century AD in Rome, and then it disappears. And then it was only in the 19th century that the German psychiatrists invented it for persecutionary kind of illness.
It was still operating on that idea of another voice, of a guiding thing.
That's somehow in that period of time it became out of vogue to have voices. It's just that wasn't the way to do it anymore.
What happened?
That's right.
How did that change?
Because, well, one other thing to compare is we were talking earlier about if your voices are good, you're a saint. If your voices are bad, you're schizophrenic. And this is so because in the bicameral period, the voices that you heard were all good. You had been trained from the age of 4, when children start to hallucinate quite a bit. Even in our culture, they hallucinate, but we immediately get them out of that. But back in the bicameral times, the child of 4 was taught, yes, you will be hearing the voices of gods and so on, and these were organizations of all admonitory experience that told him good things, encouraged him to do the right thing, and told him not to do the wrong thing. But in conscious times, children aren't brought up this way, and in fact, children are brought up not to hear the voices. And another place you can find this is in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, of course, is the story of the breakdown of the bicameral mind among the Hebrews and its replacement with consciousness. And if you read, for instance, some of the oldest parts of the Old Testament, such as the book of Amos, Amos is almost a bicameral man. and compare it with something like Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, very, very conscious man. He's the
And
wonderful.
he's thinking about things. He talks about himself thinking about things. Is that the difference?
Yes.
And the other one, when the bicameral man wouldn't talk about himself thinking about anything, it would be the God would be talking to him.
Yes, Amos goes along. They ask Amos who he is. He says, "I'm not a prophet," whatever that may mean. That's what he says. "I'm just a poor little shepherd boy," as the King James Version has it. "I'm a gatherer of sycamore fruit." And then he goes along and says, "Wait, here it comes." And the King James Version is, "Thus saith the Lord, thus saith Yahweh." And out comes this huge, long speech that I don't think Amos understands himself. And this is like the bicameral man. It's not exactly that, because the voice is not telling him personally necessarily what to do. It's telling all of his people, all of his country what to do. And this is very much prized in the life of his time, which is 800 BC. And of course these scribes are following Amos. Amos is illiterate, and they are writing down everything he says very carefully. But you go to Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes is, he's the person who says, "In my heart I see that understanding is this, and this."
So what he's done then is he's internalized the
Right.
God or the gods.
That would be one way to put it.
It
What's
became
another
his
way
instead
to
of
put it?
someone else's.
I think consciousness is a lot more than the internalization of gods. I think it is really this creation of a metaphor space in which you have an analog of yourself and of the world and so on, which is
An
a
inner
great
space.
deal, yes, an inner space in sort of quotes. It's not a real space, although we feel it's a real space. I mean, it's astonishing when you think that right here and now, right here the three of us are sitting around in my office here. I can't help but think, behind your eyes, a little space in there, behind my eyes, a little space. Every time I introspect, a little space in there, and my ideas go around. And we know that that's not true. It's something we assume, just as in mathematics. You put down various postulates, make deductions from it. Those postulates don't necessarily have to be real, yet they're what make mathematics work. And it's the same thing with consciousness.
With consciousness expanding drugs and of course the whole Eastern religious construct has a great deal to do with the infinity of that space, or the
All right.
What was the thing that brought that was that space there, and the conscious man, as opposed to the bicameral man, stumbled onto it, or did the conscious man created that space? What happened? Why did he do that? How did he manage to do that when the other fellow had been going along listening to it outside of him all that time?
And happy.
That's right. That's a historical question. It happened in the second millennium BC, towards the end of it. And there are a whole confluence of causes that caused the breakdown of this bicameral mind, of these bicameral kingdoms in Mesopotamia, for example. They didn't work anymore because there was an era of such social chaos that we really can't imagine it. We have to imagine most of the civilized world suddenly in utter chaos. Now, one of the things that happened then was the sinking of the land space around the island of Thera that we've realized now is the origin of the myth of Atlantis. But what this did was to cause a tidal wave that was just so vast you can't imagine it. I mean, as high as a skyscraper, just roaring all over that part of the Mediterranean, with a force of wind that some people regard as, like a hydrogen bomb. This is being estimated now by geologists. It's very, very interesting work. But this started a whole bunch of migrations that in Greece becomes the Dorian invasions that nobody knows anything about. It becomes the invasions of Egypt. It calls the people of the sea. It becomes all these migrations start happening like a big game of musical chairs as everybody is moving in on everybody else. Now this is one of the causes. There are other causes, but towards the end of the second millennium BC, mankind is really in bad shape. The kingdoms have toppled. You can't trust your gods anymore. Your kings aren't there. Everybody's in migration. Everybody except one place. That's Assyria. and Assyria starts mopping up and makes the first big, cruel, brutal king. These are historical facts that all this happened. Now, I am saying that it is out of this chaos that mankind first learned consciousness, created it. One of you can plot these changes. In Mesopotamia, 1300 BC, we find the first literature anywhere in the world which is all this crying after lost gods, just as we have in the Psalms, for example. When am I going to see God face to face again? As the heart thirsts after the water brooks, so longs my mind after you, O gods, as Psalm 49 says. And it is exactly 1300 BC in Mesopotamian literature that this first comes in, and then this becomes almost the totality of what is called the wisdom literature of Mesopotamia. And this completely has a complete continuity over into the Psalms of the Old Testament.
Okay, so you have all of these cataclysms and people trying to recover what worked
Yes.
before.
Yes.
It's not working anymore. What was it then that something new came out of that, and this big change happened? Is it because the gods just stopped talking to the people?
It's because
And it didn't happen anymore?
the gods probably did not stop talking right away, but they probably told people very maladaptive things to do. Not quite as badly as in modern schizophrenic patients, but probably it was very maladaptive to do what these voices told you to do. Remember what the voices were. They were syntheses and amalgamations in a very careful way of all the admonitory experience that you'd had from parents, kings, viziers, and all that kind of thing. Yeah. All stored in the brain and all reorganized and put into linguistic code. I think this is, of course, being done in the temporal lobe of the right hemisphere. And this is the God part of the bicameral mind. Now, suddenly you have chaos, terrible chaos. All this admonitory experience, it's nothing like this has happened before, and it just doesn't work. It can't tell you what to do. Yeah. And so you've got to think of different ways of doing things. Let me give you an example. We are trying to solve some of these problems, and we are only partially there to really explaining very much of this. But supposing you are a member of some small community connected with some kind of city-state that suddenly is toppled, and somebody's invading you and just comes into your community and starts taking over, speaking another language. And let us say that they are raping your wife or something over in a corner. Now, your admonitory experience, certainly you'd hear voices saying, go over and kill these people or something, at which occasion you would be killed yourself. Now, if you could say, I have another little self in me, in a little space, and I will just wait for you till I get you outside in a dark corner when you're not looking at me, that kind of thing is of great advantage in such chaotic times. The capacity of long-term deceit is very, very important. And I think that this is one of the things that starts off consciousness. Because, of course, in our ordinary life, deceit is a very strong word, but we are not being totally honest with everybody, nor should we be. It isn't really deceit. We have all kinds of things that we do, and courtesies and so on, in which we have a little self inside ourselves. These are all metaphoric terms, of course, and that's our real self, you see, and we can delay various kinds of gratifications or whatever, or other things we're going to do, we can, in our imagination, do them. Now, this is something bicameral man could not do, and this became very, very important in this social breakdown to develop this, and mankind learned it very, very, what will I say?
Difficult.
Yes. It hardly happens. It's very primitive when it happens in Mesopotamia. It's in Greece. When it happens in Greece, a few centuries after Mesopotamia, wow, then it just starts to expand, and then it's really, I think, Greece teaches the world.
The whole thing there is...
No, China comes 1,000 years later. Chinese, we tend to think that Chinese and Indian civilizations are the most ancient in the world. Well, they are very old. They're older than Europe, but they come 1,000 years. China comes about 1,000 years after Mesopotamia. Indian, I think, about 500.
Then the whole
No, in the whole development of civilization.
this is a whole thing in evolution. Then, as it just dawns on me, I always talk about the evolution of consciousness. That really, there's a huge selective advantage.
Yes.
To being able to have a conscious mind.
Yes.
The
indeed.
conscious mind can deal with these natural cataclysms when the
Yes.
bicameral mind can't deal with.
Yes. Look at schizophrenics in the hospital.
Yeah, they can't deal with the situation. The conscious mind can.
That's absolutely right. There are only certain things that this admonitory experience stored up in the brain, probably in the temporal lobe of the right hemisphere. There are only certain things that it can do.
Well, it's really a reaction against, and the whole thing focuses around history and an understanding of history, as admonitory experience, as you call it, this historic consciousness not really being sufficient. What has gone before doesn't explain what's going on right now, and this is what
Yes. You're putting it very well.
what Margaret Mead's always referring to when she says that they're the differences of the prefigurative and postfigurative cultures, that at some point, what happened in the past, your grandmother's experience, doesn't help you to deal with what's going on today. And in short, there's the same kind of breakdown going on now, that what our grandparents were doing doesn't help us deal with a computer mechanized modern age, so that we have to rely more and more on this consciousness and less on historic understandings of how to deal with things.
Was the creation of that inner space a biochemical reaction also? I mean,
obviously there have to be brain changes going on as we go from the bicameral mind to consciousness. Now, to say that the biochemistry of consciousness, or even the neurology of consciousness, is something we really don't know anything about. And we really are making just very bad guesses at it right now. I think we do understand a little bit more about the bicameral mind, because we can actually go into the brain and find out, yes, there are areas that if you stimulate them now, we get auditory hallucinations. And these predominantly are the areas of what we call the non-dominant hemisphere, which in most of us is the right hemisphere, and they are what correspond to the speech areas on the right hemisphere. And if you stimulate those, what we call Wernicke's area on the right hemisphere, people hear voices somewhat similar to what we might expect auditory hallucinations would be.
The question came up that perhaps bicameral man had begun to realize that these voices of gods and prophets that he was hearing were really hallucinations, and that he himself was the god.
Well, how about if you view it as a realization that what had been attributed to the gods,
I know what you're saying.
Is really your own.
I know what you're saying. No.
Okay.
This is a question that's very often asked me. And I think auditory hallucinations have a very unique quality, a very special mechanism in the brain that is completely different from consciousness and antithetical to consciousness. Consciousness is a difference. It's not that mankind had been hearing voices and suddenly he realizes the voices come from his own brain. Mm-hmm. So then he internalizes it and hears them inside in a way. Mm-hmm. I really don't think that is true. Mm-hmm. I think that I don't know what a kind of internal neurological inhibition of areas of the right hemisphere went on, but I think it did come, and I think consciousness is much more of something that was built up out of language. It isn't a matter of ascribing to, it is a matter of ascribing something inside oneself, yes. But first there is the internalization of feelings, of becoming aware of internal sensations when one is about to do things.
So rather than bringing what one thought was outside in, it's simply becoming aware of what was
Becoming
was
aware first of internal sensations, but then building onto them little tags. Oh, that's a memory, which it isn't at all. It's all made up, you see. And you start thinking of a memory, memory's inside me. You see, that's a brand new idea. Actually, a memory isn't inside you, it's nowhere.
Yeah.
Actually, the space that you and I introspect on isn't inside you, it is nowhere. Just as nobody wants to say that 2 and 2 equals 4 is located in any particular place. You know, it just isn't. And it's the same way with consciousness, and the same way with memories and so on. Of course, for all these things, there are neurological events that are correlated with them, that are going on. But back in these very important times, so full of human agony, when mankind was going from the bicameral mind to consciousness, it was not simply a matter of internalizing the voices that you heard. It was a matter of getting rid of the voices, and in their stead, slowly going through this business of inventing things inside oneself. First, they are organic sensations. In Greece, we have the phrena, the lungs. We have the heart, and other kinds of internal kinds of feelings that people then ascribed this to. Instead of the god making them do something, it was my thumos, or it was my psyche, which could be many different things, or my heart, or my lungs. That's what made me do it. And then you have linguistic things being built up of putting memories in my lungs. Oh yes, my lungs remember this. I'm talking now about Greek literature back in the Iliad and following along after the Iliad, the word phrena, from which phrenology comes and so on. This is one of the early words for mind, and it's originally meant lungs. And what you find in Greek, and you can follow it right along in the Greek literature, from the Iliad, following along through the Odyssey, through the elegiac and lyric poets, through Sappho, for example. Sappho's a fascinating person to look at, because here she's the first person to talk about love being inside one and being a tempest. She talks about my heart being torn apart by these tempests of love that I have within me. Nobody had ever talked about that way before. That's part of this internalization that is going on, but it's not the internalization of the gods. It's the creating of this internal world. Until in 600 BC, with this man that we should know more about named Solon. And Solon talks about mind and consciousness exactly as you and I do. And it's all there, 600 BC.
Who was this guy?
Solon was a person. We have only about, I think it's only about 50 or 60 lines of his writings left. They're all in fragments. But we know about him from other writings, and he was a poet-ruler of Greece at 600 BC, of a certain part of Greece. He was also someone who traveled extensively. He'd probably been through Mesopotamia, which already had some kind of proto-consciousness. And when he went back to Greece, all his writings are all consistently talking about mind the way we do, and consciousness. And it's so astonishing, because actually, if you take the very preceding writers, they're not nearly as far advanced in consciousness as Solon is. Of course, one has to immediately say here that there were probably a lot of Greek writers that we know nothing about. Everything's disappeared from them. And so we're just looking at...
it was heresy.
It was what?
It was heresy. I mean, part of the disappearance is somebody saying, that's nonsense.
Well, it could... No, I don't know. I don't really think so, because the poets and writers of that time were very much admired. They were sought after to solve problems. Mm-hmm. See, this is also a reflection, for example, of the fact that consciousness was new. They might have what we would call very simple problems to solve, but there are people who could solve them better than others, and Solon was one. He'd be called to adjudicate between armies, between what to do, and so on. And of course, all during this time, too, we must remember that there were all these oracles all over Greece, Mesopotamia, and so on, that told people what to do. And these were people who, like the prophets in the Old Testament, could still hear the voices of gods and direct mankind, and they were doing this. If one takes the whole history of oracles, it's a fascinating thing about how this develops, and this is mankind trying to keep in touch with the gods that have disappeared from ordinary mentality as man has become conscious. And the ways and means and rituals by which mankind, ever since the breakdown of the bicameral mind, have been trying to get back to the voices of gods, to the old feelings of certainty, are, of course, as legion as all of our religions and all of our methods of induction ceremonies to get into various kinds of trance states or various kinds of inspiration. Music, fascinating subject. Why is music so moving and wonderful to us? And why do we have music connected with most of our religions? Music as an induction ceremony is something that can lead us into meaning and so on.
How do you know that these huge organ swells and things have religion to them, whereas if it goes dun 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 dun, it's a march? That is one that always rips me apart. How do you know that the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is something that rips you apart? What is it? It's got to be
Vibrations.
Well, music happens to have a neurological location directly next to and into those areas that in the theory of the bicameral mind the gods spoke from. Music in most of us is located on the right hemisphere, on the right temporal lobe, right next to what corresponds to what we call Wernicke's area. And the reason, I think, that music is so often used in all of our most important moments, our religious moments, and not just ourselves, throughout all tribes, always music as a kind of induction into something that's going to happen, is that I think this is a building up of excitation right there next to what used to be the place where the voices of the gods were organized and came out into an ordinary auditory hallucination. Dreams. Now there's another fascinating subject. And here's something that we do all the time, every night, and yet we'd find it impossible to think of somebody who really never dreamed at all. Now, dreaming to me is one of the most conscious experiences possible. Dreaming simply is consciousness in REM sleep. And if the theory that I've been talking about is correct, this would then mean that mankind, before he was conscious, that is before 1000 BC approximately, didn't dream the way we do. And I've gone back and tried to look into the literature to try to find out, is this so? It turns out exactly to be so. And why particularly scholars have never remarked about this, I don't know. It isn't that they didn't dream completely, it is that their dreams were utterly different than ours. They are indeed what I would call bicameral dreams. They are visitations by gods, angels, whatnot, that come and tell people what to do. And the dreamer never imagines that he's anywhere else except in his bed. Throughout the Iliad, there are 4 dreams. One of the great ones is with Agamemnon, the beginning of Book 2, when Oneirus comes to Agamemnon and tells him what to do. And Agamemnon is never anywhere except in his bed. Another example is the famous Jacob's ladder dream. In Genesis, Jacob lies down on a pillow of stones and dreams right there that he sees a ladder. It's probably the stairway of a ziggurat going up to heaven with Yahweh at the top and angels going up and down the side. And Yahweh says to him, I am the God of Abraham and of your fathers, and I shall be your God and protect you too. And when Jacob wakes up, it happened right there. He never moved. And so he then anoints those stones Bethel, house of God, because that's where it happened. Now you and I never really have a dream like that, except very rarely. When we dream, we are far away in some other land, some other country, some other situation. We're doing things very differently.
We even see ourselves doing it.
We do sometimes, which is a very inherent part of consciousness. And so the whole change in mankind of how he dreamed parallels how man thinks, and indeed this whole development of consciousness. If one were to try to look over these last 3,000 years, which are the years since the bicameral mind broke down, since the invention of consciousness and its development, one can see that all around us are the remnants of our bicameral past, in terms of all of our religious heritage, as well as reactions to what we have lost in not hearing these voices of certainty anymore. For example, one can take the whole history of politics over this time. There's no question about politics in the bicameral world. That's what it was. After the bicameral world, we had to invent new ways of governing. And so, if we take the broad view of history, we find we go into a dictatorship this time, an aristocracy this time, democracy this time, and so on. And I think, of course, mankind is learning just what kind of government is best. But these are slow and agonizing things, and the whole history of wars and battles is indeed this history of mankind trying to solve this problem of governing. And nationalism having been one kind of sort of, you can look at it almost as a kind of replacement for gods at one time, that is finally at last disappearing until we are becoming indeed a world culture now. And I feel rather optimistic about that. But there are a lot of other things that can be interpreted this way. One could take the whole history of logic that really begins in the concept of logos, of reason, back just at about 400, 500 BC in Greece, and follow this up to modern times, coming out in one-sided mathematics and other things, all of this being related. Let's take the large view.
Yeah.
Mankind, up through Neanderthal times, up to 10,000 BC, was what I call a tribal mind. Not conscious, not anything, but developing language. Call it what you will.
Baby.
From 9,000 BC to 1500 BC, this was the bicameral mind that organized mankind into civilizations that did the greatest of our inventions and everything else.
With the
From-
hallucinatory help.
Yes. Now, from 1500 BC or 1000 BC to, should we call it 2000 AD, is not very long. And this is what we can call the subjective conscious period of mankind. Now, that's only 3,000 years. And let us try to think of 100,000 AD, all right? Everybody now think of 100,000 AD. We've only been 3,000 years into subjective consciousness.
Yeah, but don't you think there's a kind of an acceleration of the pace of things? I mean, it seems...
Terrific.
Yeah.
absolutely. We know
Look
this.
where we've gotten
Yeah,
in
so-
3,000 years.
Still not long enough. Huh?
But we really don't know whether we are changing now. I, of course, regard us as in a transitional period. From the bicameral mind, you can say, to what? It is not necessarily in the cards. To what?
That's what evolution's all about. You don't know what the next step's going to be. There are 100 directions you go at once, and wherever the next one is whichever one happens to hang around the longest.
It is. It's very difficult to know how biological evolution is going now, because in a certain sense, biological evolution is perhaps even going backwards, in the sense that we are developing better ways to deal with genetic illnesses. And this allows people who in an earlier age would have died off and not gone on to procreate their kind. Now they do live in our society, and the number of people who will have inherited illnesses, such as diabetes, is increasing and will continue to increase. And medical people are very worried about this. And so in a certain sense, we don't really know what is happening to biological evolution, but we shouldn't think of biological evolution suddenly taking us off into making us angels and so on. This probably isn't so. But our cultural evolution, our cultural development, the development of what is going on in consciousness is largely a cultural thing taught to us in childhood, in which we do various things, have various operations that go on in this mind space that we have learned, we need language for, and the possibilities that indeed this could change and be very different in 100,000 AD. That is a very likely possibility. Well, if one looks back at all these ancient kingdoms and how they were organized, and the bicameral mind that was responsible for this, and we look at all its ruins around the world today, and how the ziggurats have crumbled into the dust, and how the fires that where Hector's body was being burned have flickered and are out. All this, that was the business of the gods. The gods have now migrated out of what I have called the posterior part of the temporal lobe of the right hemisphere, outside the skin, into temples and churches and heavens, where we still seek them, leaving us uncertain, seeking archaic authorization, looking around for what is right and wrong, looking around for tests of logic and reasoning, leaving us conscious. And when we think that this consciousness, this invention of spaces behind everybody's eyes and in ourselves, and all this thing that we do when we are conscious of another person, this is the most human thing about us. And that humanity is really only 3,000 years old. And that is less than 100 generations, from which I think we can conclude that we are all still very young. Up music.